motherfucker don't know about Tooka. Tooka, badass nigga, know what I'm saying? Cash ass nigga, swag ass nigga. Tooka, know what I'm saying? He was a good dude, man.
No, I don't trust him. Like, come on, fall. Everyone's big ass head. No, I just said it's gonna have a little. Watch this.
Ain't nobody paying attention to you.
January 12th, 2011 began like any other day in the Woodlawn neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. The morning was cold, the kind of winter chill that swept across the concrete streets of 63rd and St. Lawrence. Shondale Gregory, known to everyone around him as Tooka, was a 15-year-old 10th grade student at one of Chicago's public schools. He was born on August 10, 1995, which meant his 16th birthday was less than a year away, a milestone he would never reach. Tooka lived in a neighborhood where the gang landscape was unforgiving, where affiliations defined daily life and territorial lines were drawn in blood. According to those closest to him, Tooka was a member of the Gangster Disciples, or GD as they were known throughout Chicago's South Side. But this wasn't something he chose in the abstract sense. He was raised in gang territory. His neighborhood, the blocks around 63rd and St. Lawrence, were controlled by his gang. For a young man growing up in Woodlawn, staying neutral wasn't an option. You were either part of the system or a target within it. On that January morning, the tension between the Gangster Disciples and their rivals, the Black Disciples, was reaching a fever pitch. This wasn't a new conflict. For months, perhaps even longer, the two gangs had been exchanging threats not just on the streets, but through music, through social media, through the violent language of the street. The rivalry extended far beyond just Tooka's immediate neighborhood. Different sets and cliques operated within the broader gang structure, and alliances shifted based on neighborhood lines and personal disputes. Months earlier, a Black Disciple member had been killed. Some accounts say it was a young man named Reezy from O-Block, and the Gangster Disciples were believed to be responsible. The killing created a debt, a blood debt that needed to be repaid. In the world of Chicago's gang culture, retaliation wasn't optional. It was expected. It was understood. When one of your own fell, you had to answer, or you lost face and territory. Tooka, despite his age, had become a known name on the streets. He was part of the movement, part of the culture, part of the cycle. He wasn't a rapper. He wasn't famous. He was just a 15-year-old who had been absorbed into a world he didn't create and couldn't escape. As the day progressed into afternoon, Tooka went about his business. The specific details of his afternoon are largely unknown. His movements weren't being tracked. His actions weren't being documented. He was just another teenager in Chicago, moving through his neighborhood, making decisions that seemed normal to him, but would prove fatally significant. He had friends around him, people he trusted, people who moved in the same circles. The hours ticked by. School was behind him for the day. The afternoon turned toward evening, and the South Side streets began to shift from the rhythm of daytime activity to the tension of nightfall. Around 6:30 p.m., as evening darkness began to settle over the South Side, Tooka made his way to the westbound bus stop at 63rd Street and St. Lawrence. He wasn't alone. Two other young men were with him. They were waiting for the westbound 63rd Street bus, a routine part of city life. People waiting at a bus shelter, waiting for transportation, waiting to get somewhere. There was nothing in that moment that suggested danger. There was nothing that indicated this would be the last hour of Tooka's life. The bus stop was a public place. It was ordinary. It was the kind of place where thousands of Chicagoans passed through every day, a normal intersection of the city's transportation system and the lives of its residents. According to witness accounts documented by Chicago police, a dark-colored vehicle pulled up to the bus stop. The car stopped. What happened next happened fast. The kind of violence that occurs in seconds but changes everything. A passenger jumped out of the vehicle. Witness descriptions would later note that the person was wearing a half mask. a face covering that obscured their identity. The gunman approached Tooka and exchanged words with him. According to witness testimony, the first thing the gunman did was ask a simple question. "Isn't another bus coming?" It was casual. It was mundane. It was the kind of thing someone might say at a bus stop. But it was also a setup, a moment to position himself, to get close enough. The shots rang out across the Woodlawn neighborhood. The sound of gunfire is distinctive and unmistakable. It echoes. It creates panic. It transforms a moment of normalcy into a scene of trauma. Witnesses scattered. People who had been going about their evening suddenly found themselves in the middle of a murder scene. The two young men who had been waiting with Tooka at the bus stop saw what happened. They became witnesses to execution. They became keepers of a truth that the streets would try to rewrite, that the gang culture would try to obscure, that the cycle of violence would try to erase. The shooter fled the scene. The vehicle disappeared into the Chicago night. In the immediate moments after the shooting, the 63rd and St. Lawrence bus stop became a crime scene. Tooka lay on the ground, mortally wounded, bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds across his body. The violence was over in seconds. The consequence would echo for years. Emergency services were called. Police arrived at the scene. The 15-year-old boy who had left his home that morning was now pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner would later confirm what was obvious. Tooka died of multiple gunshot wounds. The coroner's report would document each injury with clinical precision, converting a teenager's murder into data. Within the streets of Chicago, rumors began to circulate almost immediately about who had pulled the trigger. Various names surfaced. O.D. Perry, a 20-year-old member of the Black Disciples and an up-and-coming figure in the drill rap scene, became the most prominent suspect in street accounts. O.D. Perry was known for carrying a long-barreled chrome revolver, the exact type of weapon used to kill Tooka. In the hours and days following the murder, O.D. Perry was photographed with this distinctive firearm. Some accounts suggest he posted pictures of himself with a revolver on social media, almost as a confession, a statement that he had made the hit, that he had answered the call for retaliation. But despite these suspicions, despite the street knowledge that circulated through the neighborhood, despite the apparent evidence, O.D. Perry was never formally charged with Tooka's murder. The Chicago Police Department documented their investigation. They gathered evidence, but the case ultimately remained unsolved in the formal, legal sense. No arrests were made specifically for Tooka's murder. No one was charged. No one stood trial. A 15-year-old boy was killed in the middle of a major American city, witnessed by multiple people, investigated by police, and yet the legal system produced no prosecution, no conviction, no justice. This wasn't unusual in Chicago. Gang-related homicides often went unprosecuted. Witnesses were afraid to testify. The culture of the streets operated on its own justice system, one that didn't require or respect court proceedings. One death would be answered with another death. The cycle would continue. In the weeks and months following Tooka's death, his neighborhood responded. The young men in his gang, his family, his friends, they absorbed the trauma of his loss. The streets of St. Lawrence and 63rd transformed into a memorial to a murdered child. The neighborhood that had been known locally by one name began to be called something different, Tookaville. It was a tribute. It was a renaming that acknowledged that this place, this corner, this territory had been forever marked by Tooka's death. His mother, Dominique Boyd, was left to grieve. She lost her son to a violence she couldn't control, couldn't prevent, and couldn't avenge through the legal system. She was left with questions, with grief, and with a son whose name would live on, but in ways she didn't anticipate and wouldn't want. Months passed. 7 months, to be precise. The gangster disciples didn't forget. The code of the streets demanded response. And on August 10th, 2011, Tooka's 16th birthday, a date that would have been his birthday had he lived, O.D. Perry was killed. He was shot multiple times while riding a bicycle on the south side, near Martin Luther King Drive. The killing bore the hallmarks of retaliation. The shooter had waited, had planned, had made sure to execute the suspected killer of Tooka on a date that held significance. It was symbolic violence, violence meant to send a message, violence meant to balance the scales in the street's version of justice. According to federal investigations and witness testimony, it was believed that Gakira Barnes, a teenage member of the Gangster Disciples and a close friend of Tooka's, was responsible for O.D. Perry's death. Tooka's death, while significant in the neighborhood, was part of a much larger pattern of violence that plagued Chicago throughout the 2010s. The city became known nationally for its gang violence, its unsolved murders, its epidemic of gun deaths that seemed to claim new victims every day. The conflict that Tooka's death ignited between the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples continued for years, claiming dozens of lives. Federal law enforcement eventually stepped in, launching RICO investigations into gang organizations responsible for multiple homicides. Scores of alleged gang members were charged in cases that encompassed dozens of murders, including indirectly the network of violence that claimed Tooka's life. January 10th, 1996 to January 12, 2011, Shondale Tooka Gregory lived for 15 years. In that time, he became part of a neighborhood, part of a gang culture he was born into, part of a conflict he didn't create. His death became a turning point,